right, well, good afternoon. Like she said, I'm Fran, and I did this study along with my advisor, Dr. Wilkerson, and it was over, hi, come on in, that's just fine, and it was over the early adulthood experience of having a sibling with a developmental disability. To begin, the sibling relationship is very unique. The sibling relationship is commonly characterized by shared cultural background, experiences, and genetics, with increases in family mobility, divorce rates, and subsequent remarriages. It's possible that the sibling relationship has more chances now than ever to prevail as the stronger familial relationship. Sibling relationships can show unique patterns throughout the changes in developmental periods and can be one of the most enduring human relationships. Also, the developmental period of early adulthood is very important. Previous researchers have established the importance of this developmental period regarding psychosocial and cognitive transitions that occur in individuals as they enter young adulthood and leave late adolescence. These include the following particularly relevant developments in the early adult individual: the ability to acknowledge and accept his or her own emotions, becoming more self-reliant in decision-making and taking responsibility for his or her own actions, establishing interpersonal relationships by accepting the differences of others, and establishing a sense of purpose, and finally, developing identity, which is the individual's acceptance of his or her own characteristics. Identity is typically not developed until the late 20s and is never fully complete in the lifespan. More people than ever are living through early adulthood as a sibling with a developmental disability. In 2014, there was a 5.76% lifetime prevalence of developmental disabilities in children aged 3 through 17. This included children with intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, and other developmental delays. Additionally, the trend in deinstitutionalization is increasing the number of individuals that are residing both at home and in our communities. And finally, the life expectancy for individuals with a developmental disability is increasing. It is now similar to that of the general population. And in previous decades, this is compared to previous decades when individuals with developmental disabilities died at a much younger age. And finally, only 2 qualitative studies were found, and neither focused specifically on this time period of early adulthood. The purpose of our study was to explore the early adult's experience of having a sibling with a developmental disability. We did this by interviewing early adults about their experience of having a sibling with a developmental disability. Gathering data from the early adult gave perspective into the experience, and from this study, a descriptive theory of the meaning of this experience and the influence on this experience emerged. So next I'm going to tell you about the methods of our study. This research is qualitative, meaning that it is primarily exploratory and is used to gain understanding and insight. This is opposed to quantitative research that is more focused on statistics and measurements and the analysis of numerical data. We used the phenomenological approach in this study. It was specifically the hermeneutic phenomenological approach that was elucidated by Van Manen. In this, it involves 4 methodological activities. So first, we selected phenomenon which genuinely interests us and commits us to the world. Second, we explored the experience as it is lived rather than how it's thought about. Third, you contemplate the themes on which that characterize this phenomenon. And fourth, transcribing the phenomenon in writing. 3 approaches are a part of this methodological activity, and we use these in our thematic analysis. First, we use the holistic approach, which involves reflecting on the description of these participants as a whole. And second, we use the selective approach, which involves reading that transcript multiple times and highlighting statements or phrases that we felt were essential to the phenomenon. And third, we use the detail approach that involved reading line by line that participant's description and reflecting on how they phrased or worded their description. Next, the limitations of our study. Situational factors such as the location of the interview and the time of the interview might have influenced our findings. To help minimize this, we allowed participants to choose the time and the place of the interview so as to avoid inconvenient hours in their schedule that could cause anxiety, or places where these individuals didn't feel comfortable discussing their sibling. A reactive effect could have been caused from the presence of our tape recorder or knowledge that everything they were saying was being recorded, but we felt that this had a minimal effect. And intentionally clear wording and rephrasing of questions was used to minimize the misunderstanding of questions that I asked. The literature review for this study consisted of 2 areas of research. The first was sibling relationships in early adulthood, and the second was sibling relationships in adulthood with a sibling with a developmental disability. In that first area of research, it regarded warmth, conflict, and rivalry in early adult siblings, how these sibling relationships change during early adulthood, and communication and closeness between siblings during early adulthood. In that second area of research, sibling relationships in adulthood, when one sibling has a developmental disability, researchers focused on quality of relationships between siblings when one sibling has a developmental disability, sibling involvement in future planning, and support needs, and also symptomatology of early adults with a sibling with a developmental disability. So now our specific study design. Our data collection took place in a location of the participants' choosing or also by phone. Only the participant and the researcher were present for these interviews. The interviews were conducted in a room in which the confidentiality of this participant's conversation was ensured. And the researcher for the study, myself, as in all phenomenological study, was the main instrument for collecting this data. The interviews were recorded using an audio note application for an iPad for later transcription and analysis. We had 6 participants in our study. There were no exclusions based on race or gender. Participants in the research study met the following criteria. They were between 21 and 35 years old. They had a sibling with a diagnosed developmental disability according to the guidelines set by the Federal Developmental Disabilities Act of 2000 per participant report. Third, they were able to communicate efficiently in the English language. And fourth, they were able to hear with or without assistive devices. In this study, we used a non-categorical approach for our recruiting of participants, meaning that we accepted participants as they came through snowball sampling or word of mouth, as long as they met the criteria for our developmental disability. The criteria for this study did not require a singular category of diagnosis for the sibling with a developmental disability. So our study, therefore, includes a heterogeneous group of diagnoses of the sibling with a developmental disability. We made the assumption that this non-categorical approach was appropriate for our study, as the purpose of this study was not generalization. So our participants were recruited in person in classrooms or in the Honors College at the University of Mississippi, and also through snowball sampling or just word of mouth. After the participant expressed clear interest in participation, the interview was scheduled. The participant gave consent for their recording to be used and that they were over the age of 21. They agreed to participate in the study, and then they were asked to participate in an interview that lasted between 1 and 2 hours. Prior to the interview, we took some demographic data on that early adult as well as their sibling to give us some context. And the interview began with the question, what is your experience in early adulthood of having a sibling with a developmental disability? All other questions evolved as the interview proceeded and conversation went on. Approval of this research was obtained from the University of Mississippi Institutional Review Board. Informed consent was obtained from the participant prior to the initiation of the interview, and each participant was assigned a participant number. Only that number was attached to the interview data collected. They were also given a pseudonym, and their true name, the pseudonym, and the participant number were kept in a chart locked in a safe location. So following that hermeneutic phenomenological approach that I talked about earlier, notes were made as themes and thematic statements were encountered and identified in that participant interview. We then investigated and selected which experiential themes were common or possibly common amongst all of those participants and represented potentially the meaning of that experience. In qualitative research, it's assumed that there is no objective position from which to study human beings. The researcher is a self-interpreting being, as is the participant in the study. Meanings in the participant descriptions were not described unless supported by textual evidence from their interview. And to increase credibility, Dr. Wilkerson, my advisor, analyzed the data for individual and common themes separately from myself, and then together we discussed what we had found in individual and common themes. For this study, the phenomenological nod was used to establish credibility. The phenomenological nod is the agreement of others reading or hearing the phenomenological writing of the investigation. All the participants that we contacted to give us a phenomenological nod concurred that the findings of our study accurately reflected their experience. The purpose of qualitative study is not to seek generalizability. The task of transferability is that of the person seeking it. And confirmability in this study was established by following closely our analysis process and the use of that phenomenological nod. So our only research question was, what is the early adulthood experience of having a sibling with a developmental disability? And so next I'm going to discuss the themes and the variations on those themes that we found through interviewing these early adults. These themes, but there are 5 major themes listed up there, and they are going to be supported as I go on through quotes from the participants, and as we go through them, I'll discuss the variations among those. So our first theme was lessons learned. Each participant expressed their experience offered lessons to be learned. The 2 variations on this theme was that there was a lesson to be learned from their sibling and that others had something to learn from their own experience. Participants spoke of their siblings with gratitude for the lessons that their experience had afforded them. One participant thought that her sibling was able to teach her a lesson through the sibling's perspective on life, and that her sibling also served as a role model for her. Some participants expressed that they are the person they are today and have the perspectives that they have today because of their siblings. Kara said of life with her sister, "I know for a fact that if she was not my sister, I'm pretty sure I would be a lot more selfish. I guess I would take a lot of stuff for granted, honestly. I know that I would. I mean, I'm not proud of that at all, but it's been a lot easier as a teaching lesson for me for her to be my sister so that I could learn, don't take things for granted." Some participants expressed that others have something to learn from their own experience. Participants thought that if other individuals with siblings without a developmental disability were exposed to their experience, then other individuals would learn the same life lessons that they had. Brad said of life with his sister, "I do think we could all learn something by living a day or two with somebody with a disability and seeing how life is with that, and really just kind of seeing, for the most part, like yourself that might not have a sibling with a developmental disability, to understand and see how you just don't know how that life is until you're put into a position where you know somebody is dependent on you no matter what. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's not. But it's more, I consider it knowledge. You know, it is more knowledge for somebody to have to understand what it's like to have to go through life like that." So the next thing we found was protective. Participants demonstrated their protectiveness in 2 different ways, by expressing concern and by advocating on behalf of their sibling. Participants expressed concern regarding their sibling's safety and their well-being. One participant expressed concern regarding her sibling's safety as she and her family encouraged more independence for her sibling. Another participant expressed concern about his sibling being able to handle being out in the real world without his help. And another participant similarly expressed concern about her sibling living in a home or anywhere that she couldn't give direct care to her sibling. Brandon said of life with his brother, "It's hard because I see him, suffering is a harsh word, but suffering down here with no friends and still living with my mom and dad, and here I am trying to put my own life together. But at the same time, I would like to help him put his life together too. And I feel like he counts on me for things that are out of my control." Participants advocated on behalf of their sibling, which was interpreted as a variation of this protectiveness. Participants expressed that their siblings should not be messed with and that they shouldn't be underestimated. One participant demonstrated this variation of protectiveness as he tried to stop a bully from picking on his sibling. One participant advocated for his sibling as he tried to facilitate social situations in which his sibling was involved. He sat down and talked with his friends and also his sibling before his sibling came to visit him in college. He wanted everyone involved in that social encounter to be well prepared for the encounter in order to protect his sibling. Participants thought that others in the world underestimated their siblings' intelligence and their abilities. They defended the intelligence of their sibling despite the fact that they were aware their sibling had a developmental disability. They also believed that underestimating their sibling was not helping their sibling reach their full potential and full range of capabilities. Reagan said of life with her brother, "He does make eye contact with you. He's not present. I really do believe that something is, he knows more than you think. Just because he can't communicate it with you, there are little things. I'll talk to him and tell him to close the door of the car, and he closes it. He takes some time, but he'll do it. I'll talk to him. He knows the way home. It's really funny, on the way home, if you take this right instead of a left to go to Starbucks or Publix to get something, he'll scream in the car and absolutely freak out. All I have to do is tell him where I'm going and why I'm going there. It can be really funny." The next theme we found common among participants was the future. Each of the participants discussed their contemplations on their future life and their future life with their sibling. There were 4 variations regarding their thoughts on the future. The first was financial responsibility for their sibling. The second was future living arrangements for their sibling. The third was having children. And the fourth was managing the future care of their sibling. I don't know what I'm doing. Participants said that they intended to become financially responsible for their siblings in the future and had already made some efforts towards that goal. One participant knew that she was the executor of her siblings' special needs will and trust. Participants discussed possible future living arrangements for their siblings. Some participants intended for their sibling to co-reside with them. Some intended for their siblings to live in their own space but very nearby. And one participant actually believed that his sibling would live with one of his aunts in the future instead of himself. Kara, who intended for her and her husband to co-reside with her sibling, said, "I've mentioned it to my brother, and he said she is welcome to stay there, or it depends on the situation. If she stayed with us for a year or 2 and then went over there with him for a year or 2, he seemed okay with it. So if something ever happened, she would be with one of us. That's the most extent that we've talked about it, but I guess when that bridge comes, we'll have to make a decision." One participant discussed the intention to have children. She reported that she had already sought the advice of a doctor on whether or not she was at a higher risk for having a child with a developmental disability because of her sibling. Participants discussed the intention to manage the care for their sibling. Each intended to participate in the caring of their sibling to some capacity. Some participants reported that their sibling and their care needs had actually influenced their job choice. Reagan said about her brother, "My priority is feeling comfortable and making the next steps that I can make to support him. So yes, I'm going to take a better paying job over maybe a cool job, traveling around Europe. I'm going to take the higher paying job that's in America because it's closer to my family and more financially sound. And it can help me, if almost anything, have a higher and higher salary. I feel almost guilty for thinking this way and thinking that I want a job that pays a lot. I hate that idea. I'm the most follow your passions and do what you love and live life through your experience kind of person. But I also realize what is my passion. My passion is my brother and making sure that he's okay." The next thing that we found was an intimacy with siblings. Each participant reported an intimate relationship with their sibling. The participants talked to their siblings frequently and reported a very close bond with their siblings, despite varying physical distances between them. The siblings of 4 participants had cell phones and frequently used them to contact the participants. Some participants illustrated their close relationship with their sibling by describing their continued communication even though they have moved away for college or for work. Hartley said of life with his brother, "It was tough at first. He called me a lot. He has a cell phone, which, by the way, he can operate masterfully. He called me a lot, like every single day. It took him a while to really kind of grasp what I was doing there, why I left, and why I wasn't coming home every day. Then it just became that he wanted to do it too. He's always looked up to me and always kind of wanted to do what I'm doing. Then he got it in his mind, well, I want to move out and go to college too. The hardest part was him understanding what I was doing and why I was the only one there." The participants described having relationships that were with their siblings that were intimate and strong enough to overcome obstacles that they faced. They elaborated on the difficulties of maintaining a close sibling bond while also knowing that they're in a caretaking position for their sibling. The participants seemed eager and willing to make the efforts necessary to help their sibling feel loved and befriended, and participants also seemed to genuinely have a friend in their sibling. Sarah said of her sister, "She gets a little headstrong. I think we both do, because it's very hard in a way. First and foremost, we're sisters, but at the same time, I'm very caretaker-ish. I'm very mama bear, even though she already has a mama bear." And the last theme we found among our participants was pragmatism. Pragmatism was a characteristic of all participants in this study. The participants realized the good and the bad in life was unavoidable, and they made their best efforts to accept the events of life as they came. They were accepting of their situation and the differences their situation had from others. One way pragmatism manifested was in the accommodations made by these participants in order to fit their siblings' needs. They described these accommodations as more of a necessity than a choice. Sarah said of life with her sister, "But there are just certain things we couldn't do or had to do in a different way. You know, going out to dinner, we would go very early. We would always be the early birds with the people who were older for the early bird special. because putting your name in and having to wait, all of those kinds of things, going to stores, waiting in line, we would have to tag team, and someone would walk around the store with her while someone else waited in line. One participant expressed pragmatism by discussing the fact that his situation could actually be worse. Brad said of life with his sister, I will say for her personally, there are a lot of persons with Angelman syndrome, that we know about and are confined to a wheelchair. And she is not, so we feel very fortunate that she can walk on her own, because having someone in a wheelchair on top of not being able to talk and not explain yourself it just makes things harder. There's really no nice way of putting it, but it's just not great for anybody. We are definitely fortunate that she can walk on her own and get around on her own. Another participant expressed pragmatism by discussing how their family's accommodations were actually not helping his sibling. He expressed that realistically his sibling could achieve more if the family pushed the sibling to do more things instead of catering to the things that he couldn't do. Brandon said of life with his brother, I guess when you have a kid or a brother with a disability, you really want to treat them the same as if they didn't have it, like there was no disability, especially with my brother. For my brother, when you're trying to get to the point where he can be independent and maybe live by himself, you have to treat him like a normal person without a disability. Every time we treat him like he has a disability, it's crippling to him. In addition to these themes, we found 2 influences that were common among our participants that they reported throughout the interview. And these 2 influences that they described were that their parents had a large influence on their experience, and also their thinking that their experience was normal to them. Their own version of normal played a huge role in their experience. So the first influence I'm going to discuss is their perception that their life and their sibling were their version of normal. They had always known their sibling with a developmental disability and would never know their sibling without it. They acknowledged that over time they realized other families were different from their families. While some participants discussed coming to an understanding, they did not remember ever being unaware of their situation. They described their situation as being their own version of normal. Reagan said of life with her brother, I knew that he was different, but it was also very confusing to me because he was my brother and I recognized that it was normal to my family. But then I also started recognizing that it was different to others. The second influence was parents. The participants described how influential their parents were on their experience. They identified how their parents facilitated their relationship with their sibling, helped explain to them their sibling's disability, and modeled the accommodations in their daily life in order to help their sibling. Sarah said of life with her sister, I think my parents have done an amazing job always being advocates for her, and that's what's gotten me into this field. I think the reason she has progressed as much as she has is because we do know her rights. My parents have always killed with kindness. They were always well educated and worked together. I do see an impact that it had on my parents' marriage. I think that's with any children. But their faith was a firm foundation, which taught me a lot of things now that I'm married, how to approach relationships. I generalize what they went through and how they dealt with things, and I think it's a testimony to their faith. Lastly, I'd like to discuss some implications that arose from the study. The findings of this study represent new knowledge discovered through the descriptions of these participants' accounts of their own experience, and it has the ability to clarify issues that have been discovered by previous research. First, some of these themes and influences pose relevant possibilities for interventions in practice. Firstly, participants believed that there were lessons to be learned from their sibling and from their own experience. In practice, early adults may feel more supported and understood by others if others were more knowledgeable about their experience. And secondly, participants expressed protectiveness over their siblings. Because they expressed concern for the mental and emotional well-being of their sibling when they left for college or work, it could be beneficial for early adults to have access to information on how to best prepare for that transition and actually make that transition of leaving the home. The majority of participants advocated on behalf of their sibling in situations where they felt someone was messing with their sibling or underestimating their sibling in a capacity. If more people had knowledge of the practices that upset siblings of individuals with disabilities, less stress would be placed on that early adult for standing up for their brother or sister. Also, professionals who interact with early adults could help them advocate for their sibling better. Thirdly, participants heavily discussed their thoughts about the future. It was reiterated by all participants that they had not been able to create an exhaustive plan for the future and discuss it with their parents. One participant admitted to being scared to initiate the conversation about the future with her parents for fear it would upset her parents. In practice, it could also be very beneficial for the parents to initiate the conversation regarding the future. It could be beneficial in easing the stress reported by the early adults' siblings for parents to discuss with them their plans and their own desires for the future and ask the early adults' input in the plan. The reported influence that parents had on participants posed relevant opportunities for interventions in practice. It's possible that parents were such a strong influence in their lives because in a sibling relationship in which one sibling has a developmental disability, parents are needed to provide a bridge between the siblings and to help the non-disabled sibling navigate his or her own relationship with their sibling with a disability. In practice, it could be beneficial for parents to be cognizant of their role as a mediator so that they may best facilitate this relationship. Parents need to be aware that their approaches and their support influence this experience. Next, I'm going to talk about implications in practice and education. No other qualitative studies have been conducted to investigate the subject of early adulthood experience of having a sibling with a developmental disability. Those who interact with early adults who have a sibling with a developmental disability could benefit from knowing that by asking the early adult what their experience is like and listening to the account of their experience, they can learn much about the sibling, the experience, and the interventions that could help them. Knowledge of the findings of this study could assist parents in better understanding more about the experience of their own early adult and how that they can help this early adult navigate their own relationship, and could also assist them in initiating conversations with their early adult regarding their experience and how they can help them throughout their whole experience. And last, implications in research. Replication of this study with samples in settings other than the southern region of the United States with a wider range of ethnic and socioeconomic groups would serve to broaden the existing understanding of the early adult's experience. Longitudinal studies on the subject may provide useful information about the differences and similarities of the experience throughout the various developmental stages. And additionally, a replication of this study with more numerous diagnoses of the sibling with a developmental disability, an increased number of participants in each category of diagnosis would be beneficial in gaining knowledge on the early adulthood experience. This would provide useful information regarding the experience of early adults with siblings with one diagnosis compared to the experience of early adults of a sibling with another diagnosis. And so this concludes the discussion of this specific study into the early adulthood experience of individuals with a sibling with developmental disabilities. And now my thesis advisor, Dr. Wilkerson, is going to discuss a comparison of experiences.
Okay, good afternoon. Before I'm going to start with the comparison that I wanted to do, because I really wanted everybody to see a comparison of what we found with the early adulthood experience as compared to the adolescent experience of having a sibling with a developmental disability, specifically in this case, Angelman syndrome, which of course is particularly interesting to those of us in this room. I wanted to say why did Fran and I do this study? We did it because I'd done several studies with adolescents, and the findings we found in the adolescent study pointed to the need that it really would be good to talk to individuals who are in their early adulthood period, particularly because there's very little research in that area. So when Fran talked about the categorical versus the non-categorical approach, and the reason that's important is because, as we all know, Angelman syndrome is relatively rare. It costs a lot to do research studies, and so one question out in the research community is, do you really have to talk to adolescents or early adults in every single diagnosis group? Or can you say, let's just do developmental disabilities? There's enough similarities to support that. So I'd done a study with adolescents with Down syndrome, adolescents who had a sibling with Down syndrome, and adolescents who had a sibling with Angelman syndrome. And the findings were almost identical except for what you would expect because of the variances in those two disorders, people with Down syndrome had more communication, verbal communication, than those with Angelman syndrome. Individuals with Down syndrome, as they get older, have less issues with seizures and things like that were really, really honestly scary to adolescents who were helping care for their siblings with Angelman syndrome. And the happy demeanor aspect of Angelman syndrome really had a heavy influence on that adolescent study. So since we found that the Down syndrome study and the Angelman syndrome study had similar outcomes, we thought it was fair to do early adult and use a non-categorical approach and use anybody with Down syndrome. So, I mean, anybody with any developmental disability. Fran didn't share, but we did have one early adult who has a sister with Angelman syndrome. So in the study, they're actually just incidentally, because we did snowball sampling, there was early adult who had a sibling with Angelman syndrome. So the categorical versus the non-categorical, that's an important thing for us as parents. I'm a parent. That's an important thing for us as parents and for early adults to realize why somebody chooses which approach over the other. The other thing I wanted to hit on were two things. One is quantitative versus qualitative research. I just happen to be a qualitative philosopher. I mean, researcher, because it goes along with my philosophical framework. But quantitative and qualitative research, you really need to look at that when you're looking at findings on it, because oftentimes we as parents get really distressed over findings of quantitative studies, what the results are on effects. And a lot of times that's because if you're looking at a child behavior checklist, or if you're looking at dysfunctional family functioning, well, guess what you're going to find? You're going to find behaviors, and you're going to find those things. So you have to really look at the instrumentation that's being used in qualitative and quantitative studies to say, is there an assumption there? Are we already making an assumption that there's going to be a problem with behavior? Are we already making an assumption that it's going to affect family functioning? And that doesn't mean the findings aren't good, but it means that we need to take the findings, in the context that they are. And the third thing, before I get in my results, y'all are all hearing all my soapboxes, is the pathogenic versus the salutogenic approach. Those are philosophies and approach with research, and if you look at something pathogenically, you're looking at what's wrong with the situation. Pathogenically is the traditional medical model where you're going to go in and find something wrong, and then you're going to do something to fix it, versus the salutogenic approach when you're going in and finding out what's right in the situation. So if that makes any sense, if you've got somebody who has maybe an addiction to alcohol, you're going in and finding why they're addicted to alcohol instead of looking at why somebody's not addicted to alcohol. So it changes your intervention. Does that make sense? If you're looking at why somebody does something positive, then you're going to get a different intervention that you're looking at somebody. So we take the salutogenic approach where and I think you have to own the fact that may have some influence on the findings. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I own up to those assumptions, because we're more going in saying what's right about this situation than what's wrong with this situation, okay? So to get to the comparison, because this is what was really fascinating to me and I haven't even talked to Fran about it because we knew I was going to do this part, and then I did more thinking about the previous studies we've done, and the purpose of the adolescent studies were the exact same purpose as the early adult. We wanted to see what the experience was like, okay? I personally believe that if we as parents understand how our adolescents think about a situation and how our early adult children, I have 2 early adult children who have a sibling with Angelman syndrome. If we understand that, then we can maybe do things a little differently now. When I have early adults, I've already passed adolescence. I can't do anything to help them there. But I might could do something now. But, this room really should be filled with people who have little children, because when we do studies like this is what helps them the most, is for them to hear this now. Because if we have children with adolescents or early adults, we can do what we can, but we could have made an even huger difference if we would have done some interventions when they were 4 and 5. And I don't know, we did a SIB shop yesterday. Anybody have children who participated in the SIB shop? You would be amazed what we had 5 to 10 and 5 to 9, 10 to 13, and then 14 through 16-year-olds. You'd be amazed what 6 and 7-year-olds are saying. And it's not the things that people in this room think they're saying, like resentment and things like that. But not at all, that's what they're saying. But the things that I see that you can do as interventions are what I'm getting ready to present, that they're worrying about, believe it or not, they're worrying about at 10 years old. Some of these things I'm getting ready to talk about at adolescence. So with all that, it took forever for me to get this slide, but here's the comparison of themes. So remember, the purposes of the study were the same, the designs were exactly the same, okay? So Fran presented on the early adult experience, and you just heard the lessons learned, protective, the future, intimate with sibling, and pragmatism. Now, I want you to look at what the findings were. This is actually an Angelman study. These are adolescents who had a sibling with Angelman syndrome. They said that they're describing their experience, that their experience brought happiness. That was the difference in the Down syndrome study. Thoughts of the future. These kids in this study were 14 to 18 years old. They were thinking about the future. The 14-year-olds were, even. What was going to happen when their parents were no longer there, what was going to happen when they went to college. 14 to 18-year-olds, Fran found the same thing in our early adult study. Increased workload and level of responsibility. You're going to hear the adolescents talk about that, and you're going to hear the school-age kids talk about that. I heard them talk about it yesterday. We didn't hear the early adults talk about it. You could make all sorts of assumptions. Maybe it's because they're away at college, so they're not having to participate in the increased workload. Pragmatism is huge. 14 to 17, they said, so similar to what the early adult study said, that this is how life is. You take the good with the bad. You can't have the good if you don't have some bad with it. You know, no life's perfect, saying that at 14 to 17. Intense love, which included the protective aspect that Fran has spoken about. That's a tough one. I heard the kids talk about yesterday about the retarded word, and that was my group, the 10 to 13-year-old, talking about what to do about that. They're worried about that. They don't know how to handle it. And embarrassment, I will say here, they were not embarrassed about having a sibling with Angelman syndrome. They were not embarrassed about Angelman syndrome. They were embarrassed about the behaviors. That's the same thing that embarrasses me. You know, when I can't get my child to get up and move, right? And you're in the restaurant and you're like, we really need to get out of here. And it's not happening because now if she doesn't want to go, she's not going to go. And so it was really the behaviors, not at all the Angelman syndrome. And then the experience taught patients understanding and how to face adversity. So if you look across over there, the experience taught patients understanding and how to face adversity is lessons learned. The protective in the study Fran just spoke about is under intense love. The future is the future. They're still talking about the same future they were talking about. Part of that is because it's not resolved. So they're going to keep probably when we do a study, it's something we're stepping on or something over here. But I'm glad I'm entertaining my friends with Angelman syndrome. So they're still talking about the future. I suspect when we talk to 40-year-olds, they're still going to be talking about the future. I wonder if we spoke with parents, if they'd be talking about that. I don't know. Intimate with siblings, same as intense love, and the pragmatism was on both sides of that. So obviously, the early adults are having very similar experiences to the adolescents. And we could probably surmise some reasons why on that. You don't, just as an aside, you really don't see many qualitative studies with school-age children. Mainly the reasons being that IRB is really the institutional review board that you have to have approved to do research. It's really hard to get it through with children. And also it's really hard to interview children. Now you see a lot of quantitative studies with school-age children because it's really easy to give a parent a child behavior checklist. The other thing in a lot of the literature with adolescents and with school age, they're asking the parents what they think, not the children. Amazingly, you get different results when you ask the children versus the parent. Okay, so influences. Fran talked about the influence of the parents. We make a huge difference, according to adolescents and early adults, in how they feel about things. So how the parents approach it really directly affects how their experience. So they say, the early adults said that they realized how hard it was on their parents and they wish they could do more to help their parents out. And they really appreciated the way their parents approached the situation. And so then if you look at the adolescent side, they had the parents' response too. Now they also had the knowledge level related to how much they understood about Angelman syndrome. They had the behaviors, which we've already spoke about. And just so we know, the behaviors the adolescents talked about most being difficult for them were the mood swings, the aggression at times, like, I don't know, they had something done and they destroyed it, or the pinching, or some things like that. One of the big things adolescents struggled with are the sit-down strikes. We also know so well that they didn't know what to do when they got them in a situation and then they couldn't get them to move. A lot of the adolescents still take and they talked about this in their embarrassment and the behaviors, they didn't let the embarrassment really keep them from doing what they were already doing. They'd still take them to Walmart or whatever, but it really did increase their stress level with not knowing what to do. Ability to communicate, that's obvious. Medical acuity, specifically it was a seizure disorder. The adolescents were scared to death. Their sibling was going to have a tonic-clonic grand mal seizure, and they were going to be babysitting, and they weren't going to know what to do. I actually talked to the 14 to 16-year-old. I talked to every group yesterday in the SIB shop. Well, my son talked to the little ones, and we talked about what to do in a seizure because we know that the siblings are afraid of it. So we talked about, here's the actions you do. You call an adult. If you can turn them on the side, you do. Don't put anything in their mouth and make the environment safe. That's all you're supposed to. Okay. That's all you're supposed to do. I said, that's all you have to do. That's all you have to worry about. And for the 14 to 16-year-olds, was anybody in there in the 14 to 16? I don't think okay. I told them that I knew they babysat a lot, that they would be responsible for the care, and what they needed to do that night in the hotel room was to ask their parents what the parent wanted them to do if their sister or brother had a seizure, so that they didn't have to worry about that anymore. Because I know, I'm a parent too, none of us want our children having to worry about that. Okay, so, beats me. I teach on the college level. You could probably do almost anything to me and I could keep talking, it doesn't matter to me. So I just keep on, doesn't matter. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to say about this, and then we'll take questions, are here are some interventions when you look at comparing the adolescents and the early adults, okay? So the similarities point to these possible interventions that parents need to be doing. okay? And we need to be doing this as early as we can in an age-appropriate manner. Again, not part of the study, but 10 to 13-year-olds are concerned about the future. So how to manage behaviors. We need to start telling our children, our siblings who don't have Angelman syndrome, we need to tell them as early as we can, we need to model how to correctly, appropriately handle behaviors and talk about how to handle behaviors. We just need to go on and have that conversation and model it so that they know what they can do if when they become an adolescent, they don't know what to do with a behavior. If they learn it early on, then, so we need to be showing them how to handle that. And we as parents need to be taking measures to intervene with that. Y'all probably aren't like me. I avoid handling, the behaviors are really hard. And, I went to that neurobehavior. I've got my son right now and the medications for the anxiety thing and behaviors because I don't know, it's just really hard. But we need to tell even our school-age kids, but certainly the adolescents and middle adults, that this is the best way to handle the behaviors and model them. We need to teach our children as early as we can how to advocate. The adolescents were really stuck on the retarded word too. That word, hopefully it'll go away one day, but every time I'm in a group, they bring it up, and not quite knowing how to handle that. They also, as Fran talked, and what we found with early adults, they really feel the need to advocate for their sibling with a developmental disability, but they're not quite sure how to do the advocating. I think they're not there when the parents are doing the advocating, so they don't understand how that's happening. We're doing it at IEP meetings and they're not there, right? They're in school, they're not at the physician necessarily with us doing that. So they need to know how to advocate and how to advocate appropriately. That's a really hard skill. Okay, keeping the sibling informed. Parents need to keep the sibling informed continuously and at age-appropriate language. We're really guilty, and that's what the studies showed, of telling our children what Angelman syndrome is when the sibling's diagnosed. Or we tell them as soon as they ask if they're old, if the sibling with Angelman syndrome is older. So they understand Angelman syndrome at age 5 or age 10, but we don't keep on updating on what it is. So then they get to be in their 20s or in their teens, and they don't, as Fran shared, they're not quite comfortable asking their parents about some things, not because the parents are bad, but because it's an uncomfortable thing to bring up about what is this and do I have to worry about my children getting it. So we need to keep on informing about Angelman syndrome as they age, just like you would anything else. And the last thing, which I think is the really important thing and the hardest thing. I was just talking to my son will be 30 next week, who's here with me. I was just having this conversation with him again on the future. The future, I just said the school-age kids were talking about it yesterday. The adolescents talked about it in the study, in the Down syndrome study and the Angelman study. The early adults talked about it in that study, that they are thinking about finances. One of the individuals in our study actually thought, you heard her, she made a job decision based on it. Some of these early adults actually really thought that they were going to be supporting their sibling with a developmental disability, like literally supporting them. Living arrangements, that's very confusing and sometimes worrisome. I'll tell you, most of the people, or probably at least half the people Fran interviewed and half that I did in both adolescent studies, they really believed their sibling was going to be living with them. And however you want to go with that, but they did think that they were going to be financially supporting them and having them living with them. They all at least thought they'd be managing care. So we really need to be talking about the future. We really do. And when I was just talking to my son, because my sons don't want my husband and I on the same airplane, because they're like, what if we have a crash, then what's going to happen, you know? And I'm going to speak to the parents on this, because maybe y'all are better than me about it. But, you know, I know my son is worried about it. You know, I know he's got a wife and a son, and, you know, he's thinking if something happens to me, he wants Paige to be the best taken care of, but how is he going to do it and have a family and a job and, you know. And so, but I told him the reality is I'm trying to work on future plans, but I can't figure out how to get any help with it. You know, anybody else in here have an adult child with Angelman syndrome? Raise your hand if you have an adult child with Angelman syndrome. I know some people do because they're in here.
Yes, but see, for example, for me, it's very tough. I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I already got informed this year, the last year they can go high school. For next year, they don't have nothing for them.
Right.
Nothing. No community housing.
Right.
No those homes, nothing. Nothing they can match the needs of the children.
Right, so-
The son is 20 years old. Doesn't mean, okay, well, we're gonna-
Right. So you know, I'm live in Mississippi, and I mean, I've had to have number one, you have I don't know if y'all do or not, I'll be honest and own up that we do. My husband and I really struggle with us being on the same page of when should Paige not live in the home with us or not. And, you know, we have different, it's not that we both don't love her, it's that we kind of has a harder time saying when's it going to be. He doesn't want it to happen, and I'm like, well, I don't want to die and her have to go tomorrow and never know anybody, you know, that'd be really hard. But I've been talking to people because I know my sons are concerned about this. I know they are. Not that they don't love their sister. They love their sister more than life itself. But that doesn't mean they're not worried about what's going to happen in the future. And so, you know, I keep on saying, okay, so what's it going to be? What's going to happen? And they say, well, you're supposed to keep them in the home now. That's what, you know, and I say, well, I'm 60 years old, you know, I don't know what's going to happen. But anyway, I tell my son, just because I know you're worried about the future, I know you are, and I'm working on it, but that's all I can do. I can't do any more than what I'm doing right now, and I hate that. You know, but the thing is, I probably should have been saying that to him when he was younger. You know, what are you worried about? Because he, you know, my oldest son would never bring this up, even though I'm sure he, you know, has similar concerns. So that is a call to, I think, all of us as parents, that as hard as it is, because I'm trying to keep not crying up here. As hard as it is to have that discussion of the future, and I think the more you have the discussion, the less emotional it would be. It would more be a fact-finding mission, right? Makes sense. Okay, the last thing we've already said, I'm glad you did it again. There you go. The last thing, again, that we've already talked about is how important the parents are. We really do make a difference, and I think of the negative side of that, but what I need to do is think of the salutogenic or the positive. I mean, what I'm doing is really making a difference to how my 30 and 34-year-old are approaching life about people who have differences, because of the way my husband and I approached it. So I think we need to think, instead of the negative that I do, which I do just like everybody else, that I wish I didn't, but I think we need to think our response is important. And therefore, when we're looking at our adult children, we're saying, look at them, you know, we did make a difference in this. Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions. Y'all got any questions for Fran or me about this? So we so well covered it, not a soul has a question. That's good. So, or maybe not, I don't know. I've been thinking about that on Fran and I were talking about this. I don't know whether to do another one with early adults. I'm really intrigued after my SIB shop yesterday with doing something with the school age group. It's just really intriguing to me. on what, there's really something that does cross over there, it seems, between school age and adolescence, or maybe adolescents and young adults on the workload, responsibility, embarrassment thing. And I don't know if it's developmental or what. I really think I need to do another early adult one first, though. One thing that didn't come up, which there's some early adults in here, I think. Who's got a sibling with Angelman syndrome? Raise your hand. Okay, so we probably didn't cater to our audience well enough, because most of the people in here are early adults. So I'm going to talk to y'all, because here's one thing we thought was going to come out that didn't come out, because in the adolescent study, in the older age group, it was starting to come out a little bit, but the whole reproductive thing, we really thought that was going to come out on them making, early adults having to make reproductive decisions. You heard, was it one or two, Fran?
With one person.
One person. She was the only one who was married, though, and had been married a couple of years. So we're thinking she may just have been at that stage of life, and the others were not married yet, but we really thought it would come out more on, okay, how do I ask my parents if I have to worry about having children with this? Because I don't want to ask that, because it sounds like I don't love my sibling, and I do love my sibling, but I still want to know that information. I can tell you I talked to 14 to 16-year-olds yesterday, and I think only one person in the room knew the transmission of Angelman syndrome their sibling had, which again points to the importance of us talking about Angelman syndrome every single developmental stage. So I don't know, the young adults could talk to us about that, on whether or not they may not be in the life stage they're thinking about that either. My son just had his first child, Simon's 18 months, and I actually had spoken to a geneticist. Paige has the EPD form, and I talked to a geneticist because I knew they were kind of thinking about it. And I was trying to figure out if I should just strongly recommend they talk to a geneticist, even though I really wasn't worried. But I wanted to open that door so they didn't have to open the door. And then they ended up pregnant before we even got to have the discussion. But the geneticist just really, really stayed on them about doing a genetic workup. They refused. But the matter of fact, my son told the geneticist, I don't think you understand Angelman syndrome. It wasn't the geneticist, it was the OB. And the OB kept on saying, I really think, y'all need to go talk to a geneticist. And he said, I don't think you understand how I understand about Angelman syndrome. So anyway, so we're thinking maybe young adults. What do y'all think? Should we did this for the young adults, did Fran's interviews and our analysis, did it capture it pretty well or not? I mean, honestly, I see nods. That's called a phenomenological nod, by the way. She spoke about that. A phenomenological nod in qualitative research means you take it back to the people who are actually in the experience and see if it generally captures it. It's not going to individually capture it. So thanks for that question. I did talk to Eileen Braun when we got this about whether or not, so we may be sending something out about talking to the 20 to 35-year-old group here, to find out. So we will put that call out if anybody's willing to participate with us on that.
I would actually say that I was pretty skeptical when she said this was going to be sort of an open-ended interview with only one question, and you were going to identify the relevant themes. Like, I don't know, as people who don't have siblings with Angelman syndrome, you would be the best suited to identify those relevant themes. But you did a really good job. I thought that the themes that you identified were absolutely relevant.
Well, that's a good qualitative study. I'll pat Fran on the back on that. A really good qualitative study. I mean, there isn't, when she presented her thesis research, everybody on the rest of the people who were on her thesis advisory were not qualitative researchers. And they thought maybe it's a bunch of hooey, really, didn't they, Fran? But I'm a qualitative researcher, and I know how to do qualitative research. And if you do it right and ask the questions right and say, tell me about your story, we did, some of the people talked an hour, hour and a half. What was the longest?
Well, I had people go over 2 hours.
So over 2 hours talking about their experience. And so you ask that initial question, what's this like? But then, as they're talking, you say, well, tell me more about that. And that's so much different than me going to you, Kaylee, and saying, will you fill out this instrument for me? Because when I tell you to fill out this instrument, I can only get what's on the instrument. So if you have any other experiences, they're not captured. So, and again, most of those instruments really they're making the assumption that you have an issue versus just letting you tell us what it's like. And then with qualitative, the next step would honestly be, once you have enough data to support that, then you could actually do an instrument. Because then you could take our influences and hand you something and say, do any of these apply to your experience? So, thanks for that. Anything else? Well, we really appreciate you coming. Thank you.